Good evening and welcome to this year's annual commemoration of Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass. My name is Avinoam Patt. I'm the director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life. And we are honored to welcome you here this evening for this commemoration and a panel discussion as the culmination of a course on the past, present, and future of anti-Semitism. The Center for Judaic Studies is honored to host tonight's program together with the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies, and it is at the University of Hartford. And it is my honor to introduce Regina Miller, the interim director of the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies, to offer a few words of welcome. Regina.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you this evening. This is never an easy topic. It seems as though what people might have thought was never going to be a problem again is not necessarily not a problem again. So the presenters of the first three classes of this course have a very interesting concept developed for this panel discussion tonight. And I'd like to invite you, as the program goes on, to put any questions that you might have into the chat, and I'll monitor those questions, and hopefully we'll have time to get to your questions at the end of the program. Avi, back to you.
Thank you, Regina. I'm going to share my screen because I've prepared a slideshow both for the beginning of the program and also to help us frame some of our discussion this evening. Now, as Regina mentioned, tonight's program is the culmination of a class on the past, present, and future of anti-Semitism that we've been honored to have wonderful teachers join us, Professor Deena Grant and Professor Jonathan Elukin. Professor Deena Grant is Associate Professor of Jewish Studies at Hartford Seminary. She received her PhD in Hebrew and Judaic Studies from New York University, specializing in Hebrew Bible. And many of you were here for the initial class of this series. And I should mention that all of the classes are available on YouTube and on the Center for Judaic Studies website if you want to catch up. But Deena introduced our class with the notion of anti-Judaism in antiquity and the idea of hate in the Bible. This was followed by a wonderful session by Professor Jonathan Elukin, who is an associate professor of history at Trinity College in Hartford. Professor Elukin received his PhD from Princeton University and works in several fields, including the history of Jewish-Christian relations in medieval Europe, the history of law and kingship in the Middle Ages, and early modern and modern historiography about Jews and Judaism, and the history of anti-Semitism. And indeed, his session, the second class in this series, was an analysis of how anti-Semitic were the Middle Ages. And we're going to discuss this in greater detail. And then, of course, I concluded this series with an analysis, a discussion of anti-Semitism and the development of racial anti-Semitism in the modern period. There have been so many questions that we have posed to each other that I think we're all looking forward to have this opportunity to discuss it together and to discuss it with all of you. Now, as you'll see, tonight's program is also part of a series of what we're calling this year the Virtual Holocaust Educators Workshop. Every year, the Greenberg Center at the University of Hartford hosts a Holocaust Educators Workshop on the last Monday of October. This year, obviously, this had to be a virtual workshop, and this is the third in a series of 4 programs that are part of the workshop. And this year's virtual workshop is proudly co-sponsored by the UConn Center for Judaic Studies, UConn Human Rights Impact Institute, and Dodd Impact, the Hero Center, a collaboration between the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies and Voices of Hope, and of course, the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies. There is one additional program that will be the 4th part of this series, which will take place next Thursday, November 19th, and will feature the incoming director of the Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies, Amy Weiss, who we're very excited to hear her teach next week on Thursday, November 19th on American Jewish responses to the Holocaust. Now, tonight's program is also a commemoration of Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass. And tonight's program is also made possible by the Francis and Irving Seliger Memorial Endowment at the University of Connecticut and the Center for Judaic Studies. So it is, in a sense, a commemoration, an education, and an opportunity for us to engage in discussion of a very, very current topic. I just want to make note of a number of upcoming programs that I've mentioned that are coming this year. The UConn Center for Judaic Studies and the Greenberg Center have co-sponsored our series of programs of virtual events. So it's a very busy 2 weeks that is a reflection of our programs coming together and being co-sponsored. Many of you have already signed up for these programs, but if not, please join us in the coming 2 weeks for a fascinating series of events and really sort of an exciting way for us to conclude what has been a fantastic semester of intellectual engagement and discussion. Now, as we noted, tonight's program is also appropriately coinciding with Kristallnacht, a commemoration of the Night of the Broken Glass on November 9th and 10th, 1938. That is 82 years ago, when a pogrom raged across the Reich in Germany and Austria and those parts of Czechoslovakia that were occupied. On this night, November 9th and 10th, over 1,000 synagogues were burned to the ground. At least 91, probably more, Jews were killed on this night. 30,000 Jews were rounded up and taken to concentration camps. Hundreds, if not thousands, of Jewish businesses were destroyed all over the Reich. Jewish apartments were destroyed all over, and residences were destroyed all over the Reich. It was, as some have noted, a radical turning point in Nazi policy vis-a-vis the Jews. Some even termed this date of Kristallnacht the beginning of the Holocaust. It was certainly a turning point in terms of Nazi Germany's radicalization of Jewish policy, which had been focused on legislation that was excluding Jews from German public life, that was beginning a process that we can refer to as the social death of the Jews. On Kristallnacht, that is on November 9th and 10th of 1938, this was a radical transformation that targeted not only Jewish lives, but also targeted Judaism as a religion, as synagogues all over the Reich were destroyed. And as we can see, as residents of the Reich stood by, as fire departments stood by, as police stood by, watching this pogrom rampage all over the Reich, doing nothing to stop it. Many have suggested that one of the reasons that the Nazi regime felt prepared to take this step, which at the time was a shocking, radical step for Jews living both in the Reich and Jews all over the world, was a recognition after the summer of 1938, when the countries of the world came together and seemed ill-equipped to solve the Jewish refugee crisis, as one country after another at the Evian conference raised their hands and said, there's nothing we can do to take in the Jews of Germany or of Austria, that the Nazi regime perhaps correctly concluded that the countries of the world did not care what they did to the Jews. And this, in a sense, marked a turning point where they internalized this lesson and radicalized their violence against the Jewish population. Now, I always recall on this evening the words of a Holocaust survivor who was a wonderful part of our community here in West Hartford, who passed away not long ago, Margot Jeremias. And Margot was a young girl living in a small town in Germany, not far from Heidelberg, called Hoffenheim. And on the night of Kristallnacht, in fact, on the day after Kristallnacht, she, before the pogrom had reached her town, she traveled to Heidelberg, where she was going to school. And here I want to play a short clip where Margot describes her experiences on that day as she entered Heidelberg.
things had gotten so bad, 1936 already, so bad in school that I no longer could go to school. And the Jewish children couldn't go to school anymore in 36 to the higher learning. So there were Jewish schools that started. In Heidelberg, there was a school, and I went to Heidelberg to school, which meant I had to travel an hour by train one way, each way. In 1938, in the morning of the 10th of November, I woke up and I went to school as usual. As soon as I got into the train, I heard people talking to each other saying, oh, we had such a nice time last night. We demolished the synagogue and we demolished the Jewish homes. I was sitting there fearful they would not know that I was Jewish. I got to Heidelberg and I heard the shouting and the glass shattering. As I got into the station, kill the Jew. And I mean, I can still hear the glass shattering. That was the most terrible thing you could imagine, knowing that it was against me. From that day on, I think fear never left me. The SR came, that's the brown shirt. There were 6 men and 12 SR men came to arrest the men. They walked them through the street to the municipal building. My father could not go home to say goodbye. And we did not know what was going to be, but he was arrested then and there and sent to Dachau. That time, right away, then we got ID cards. Every male was called Israel. Every female was called Sarah. We had to give away our jewelry, money. We couldn't have any weapons, including a big kitchen knife. And from then on, I couldn't sleep without saying a prayer. Please don't let me be so afraid. On Yom Kippur, we had to give the radios away in 39. No telephone anymore. We became isolated in that sense. They were watching you. They knew where you were and where you went at all times. So sure enough, in the morning at 8 o'clock, the SR came and said, you have 2 hours to pack 2 suitcases and to be at the municipal building. And you take food for 3 days. So the SR stayed in the building to make sure we did not take anything we were not allowed to take, and watched over whatever we did. I went to get some food. One of my former schoolmates ran after me and said, thank God we get rid of you Jews. I will never, ever forget that. That somebody I was friendly with could go run after me and say that.
So Margot, as you can see here in the testimony, recalls the horror and the traumatic nature of this evening. And as I mentioned, Margot passed away just a couple of years ago, but she was very active in our community and speaking to schools and speaking to children. And she was part of the exhibit, which is at the Museum of Jewish Civilization, Hartford Remembers the Holocaust, that has now been turned into a virtual exhibition that in conjunction with the Heroes Center, Voices of Hope, and the Greenberg Center, that's called Connecticut Remembers the Holocaust. And I will note that Margot was very, very concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism that she saw here in the United States in the most recent years. And she said, in 2016, as she saw rising levels of anti-Semitism, that she began to have nightmares that she had not had in 35, 40 years, as she began to feel this palpable sense of a return of newer forms of anti-Semitism. This, in a sense, gives us a context for us to engage with our discussion this evening. When we think about the history of anti-Semitism that we've talked about in this class, from ancient anti-Judaism and religious competition to a type of anti-Semitism that begins to develop and evolve from antiquity into the Middle Ages, and then a racialized anti-Semitism that we looked at in the modern period. But we're also going to talk about the many different forms of anti-Semitism that we see in the contemporary moment. That is both the anti-Semitism that is on the right and the anti-Semitism that is on the left. Anti-Semitism that manifests itself in the form of Holocaust denial, and anti-Semitism that manifests itself in anti-Zionism. And the enduring conspiracy theories that go all the way back to earlier forms of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, but seem to be resurgent in the present day. And we talked about this in the class on the modern period when we looked at modern forms of conspiracy theories, but we can see conspiracy theories that continue to present themselves in the present day, for example, in the form of QAnon, which has elements, as you can see here, of anti-Semitism, references to a global cabal or a global deep state of elites, clearly associated with Jewish control by elites, bankers, and globalists, right? And we can think about the code words that exist there in terms of modern forms of anti-Semitism. There is the anti-Semitism that we see manifesting itself in Holocaust denial or Holocaust distortion or Holocaust revisionism and right-wing movements in Europe and around the world. We don't have to look far to see Nazis marching here in America as well. And we can also see it brought into various political ideologies that also target Israel in the form of Holocaust denial too. So I think this is enough context for us to frame our discussion, and I just want to give you a sense. So Deena, Jonathan, and I have talked about the types of questions and some of the questions that came up in previous classes that we want to engage with this evening. And you can see here on this slide some of the questions that we're going to try to address. The question of how is anti-Semitism of the present moment distinct from or equivalent to other forms of bigotry, both forms of racism that we see, those forms that we've seen historically, and those of the present moment. We're also going to talk about whether contemporary anti-Semitism is the same or different from what we've examined historically, right? Is it just old wine in new bottles, or is there something different about the present moment? And the question of why does it persist? Does it challenge our belief in progress and modernity and rationalism? Are these even effective ways to try to respond to anti-Semitism? Should we try to understand it, or should we spend our time focusing on ways in which Jews who are the targets of persecution can more effectively respond to anti-Semitism? And something that came up in particular, I think, in Jonathan's session, which is perhaps, there's a tendency to focus too much on the negative, focus too much when we look historically on negative periods in Jewish history. And instead we should try to, and Jonathan might correct me here, but try to focus on sort of those long periods in between of fruitful coexistence and try to work towards that fruitful coexistence with our neighbors. So I'm going to stop the share now that you've all seen it so we can see our speakers. And I'm going to turn it over to Deena and Jonathan to begin to engage with some of these questions. As Regina suggested, we're going to be happy to, so Deena, Jonathan, and I will speak for about the next 20-25 minutes or so, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A and discussion. So Deena, if I can put you on the spot to start our conversation, and then Jonathan, you can jump in afterwards. How do you think this contemporary anti-Semitism is the same or different from what we've examined in previous periods?
Well, I mean, it's both. I would say that it is both the same and different. And you could theoretically talk about one or the other. And thinking about this question, what kept coming to my mind was the topic of the same. And so thinking in terms of that, I actually went all the way back to the Hebrew Bible, which is something I didn't discuss as much in my first talk, where I focused more on the New Testament and late antique period, thinking about anti-Semitism there, because that's usually where we start thinking about it. But going back to the Hebrew Bible, what I noticed in terms of a trend from that period on to today is the issue of political disempowerment. And I think that is something that has really come in waves, and anti-Semitism sometimes focuses on it more, sometimes focuses on it less. But this issue of this kind of fear of disempowerment, I think we see that now both on the left and on the right. To think about it in terms of the right, anti-Semitism in some way is part of a larger animus towards minority groups altogether, because there's this fear, I think, of, you know, in America, talking about in America specifically, that minority groups such as Jews, who might even have dual loyalties for existence, which is a trope against Jews, threatens the definition of what it means to be American, I think, for a number of people who have these kind of anti-Semitic leanings. And I think it may be related to this perception that America was founded on Christian principles. In fact, Christian whiteness is something that, you know, combines racism and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and a kind of fear of disempowerment of the white Christian is, I think, something that you see in white supremacist dialogue and some of their, you know, and some of the things that they're writing. And something that came to mind when I was thinking about this was in terms of the Tree of Life murders. And if I recall correctly, the person who committed this crime referred to the Jewish community as helping invaders, and Mexican immigrants, Central American immigrants, Muslims from many countries were being called as invaders by a number of white supremacy groups. And so I think in some ways, you know, Jews and anti-Semitism and Jews are kind of brought together by everyone as saying these are threats. And I think part of the rise may have to do with the changing in America, may have to do with the changing demographics in America, because in fact, yeah, I mean, happily that is being threatened, I think. We are becoming a much more diverse nation. Now, I know I can't speak forever, but when you go back to the Hebrew Bible, in fact, and you look at, and I can talk about this more in the question and answer period, when you look at some of the what we might call anti-Judaism in the Hebrew Bible, the most famous ones, for instance, in the book of Esther, in the book of Daniel, when you could even talk about Pharaoh, a lot of that is about political disempowerment. When you talk about the book of Esther, what did Haman say to Ahasuerus? She said, there is this nation that is mifuzar, that is scattered across this kind of insidious nation, and they're not behaving the way that you, king, say they should behave, say they should believe, say they should practice, and kind of bringing up this, our way of life is being threatened. So I would say that a trend that is similar today and going all the way back to the biblical period is the hate that derives from fear of disempowerment and losing power that you feel that you deserve. And those would be my comments on that.
Okay, thank you, Deena. And I think so. Really focusing on sort of some of the similarities that you know, we can go back thousands of years and see this theme of political disempowerment and using othering against a group that sort of persistently tries to maintain otherness for political purposes. Jonathan, do you want to? Go ahead, Jonathan.
Okay. What I would say is that this notion of disempowerment is interesting, but I think that one of the things we should do is think in a very kind of detailed way about what seems to be similarities, but on a closer examination, there are some interesting differences. So, for example, when we look at the violence and prejudice against Jews in the Middle Ages, what we see is not a disempowered majority or society acting against the Jews out of a sense of weakness. I mean, I agree with Deena, and I think Avi's reaffirmation of this is true, that one of the striking things about contemporary anti-Semitism, at least on the right in the States and in Europe to some degree, is an anti-Semitism or an animus towards Jews that comes out of weakness or perceived weakness, that the Jews will replace us, or that the Jews are manipulating world events, or that Soros is funding everything. So there is a sense of the right, the anti-Semite on the right. There is a sense of that individual or that community as being potentially the victim. Now, in some cases, that can't be true. I mean, if you look at Orban's Hungary, or you look at some of these other places, there's no definitive weakness in that political or social community. But if you look at the right wing here, let's say before the election, when we're talking about, you know, the community of people in QAnon, or the community of people on the alt-right who went to Charlottesville, or those kind of groups, or the Proud Boys, or these other groups, you know, those are clearly, at least we thought they were clearly marginalized groups that were, numerically and philosophically and socially marginalized. So their anti-Semitism is clearly coming from a place of weakness, either real or perceived. That seems to be a characteristic of modern anti-Semitic thinking. I mean, it's clearly there in Nazi ideology about the power of the Jews. It's clearly there in contemporary ideologies about the Jews that one saw in on the left or on the right. A sense of the Jews as sort of all-powerful and somehow manipulating events or bringing about some kind of existential threat against European Christians, and particularly a subset of those European Christians who see themselves as potentially victims. That's not medieval anti-Jewish animus. There are moments in the medieval experience where Jews are accused of certain things that suggest perhaps some larger network of Jews or some larger power behind the Jewish community. For example, the famous ones are the well poisoning accusations around 1348, which I assume Susan Einbinder will talk about next week. But those are quite idiosyncratic. They're not uniform. They're not particularly widespread. So there's no traction that those accusations got in medieval European circles to kind of smear all of the Jewish communities as being somehow involved in this, biological attack, if you will, on the Christian community. The other accusations that we know of, or that people are familiar with, the various blood libel accusations, occasionally there's some element that the Jews are gathering together and acting as a kind of unified whole to capture a particular Christian child, to sacrifice it or to murder it or hurt it. But again, that's not the dominant motif, it's not the dominant model, and it certainly doesn't, again, gain traction in the larger European medieval context. So I do think we have to be careful to say that there are particularly modern characteristics, or there are particular characteristics of modern anti-Jewish animus that we don't find either to the same degree or at all in the medieval context. So then that brings us to the question of, how do we then classify or define what we're seeing? And one way perhaps to think about it is, to think about the context or the nature of the society that the Jews were living in. That is, it's actually quite remarkable in some ways that there wasn't more of this sense of the Jews as the conspirator, as the Jews as the unified network of enemies of Christianity, as the Jews as kind of manipulating reality in the medieval past. Because if you think about sort of the assumptions about how the medieval world worked, they thought the Jews had committed deicide, right? They thought the Jews had killed Jesus, and that one would have thought that that kind of conspiratorial thinking would have been sort of front of mind for Christians, and have accused and indicted the Jews for that. So the fact that Christians in the Middle Ages didn't see the Jews in this kind of overwhelming sense of conspirators, this overwhelming sense of a kind of networked body of enemies, who will, either kill Christians, replace Christians, or undermine Christian society, or ally with Muslims or heretics or these things. That's really quite remarkable. And in a way, it speaks to kind of the intellectual and emotional, what would you call it? The healthfulness or the sanity of medieval Christians, who understood that they weren't weak, right? How could you imagine yourself to be weak, when you see the reality of the world? So it's actually quite interesting that a period of time, this medieval European period, which we think of as existing with sort of superstition and fantasy and religious mentalities, possibly has a kind of more realistic, pragmatic, realpolitik sensibility of where power lies in its own society, as opposed to the fantasists that we see, on the right in so many places in the contemporary world, particularly in how they look at Jews. So I can, there are a couple of follow-on thoughts, but I'll stop there, and Avi, you can.
Yeah, so
I'm passing the ball to Avi.
Right, thank you. So I want to follow up on both of your points, because I think what's so interesting and what I've appreciated for those of you who have participated in the class is that we've tried to structure this in looking at different historical periods and to see if that can give us any context to better understand the current moment. And I can tell you that for someone who studies, the modern period, one of the things that I find quite striking is the degree to which of the persistence of sort of a convenient hatred like this that can be used for political purposes, the fact that it persists, I think challenges for Jews our belief either in progress, in enlightenment, in democratic systems to protect our standing, even after the Holocaust, right? So I think it's quite striking for us to consider and maybe to think about, why are Jews surprised that this persists, right? And yet we do tend to be surprised anew, right? And that's one of the interesting things. I think, it's concerning too, but that, something as horrible as the Holocaust, to challenge all our belief in sort of humanity and in democratic systems, can happen. And then American Jews in particular can say, yeah, but that was there, not here. And we're protected here because we have a good functioning democracy. And then again, we are surprised when it sort of rears its ugly head. And so one of the things that I find striking is this question of sort of A, how it challenges our belief in progress, and B, the same versus the different argument, right? So we've talked about how it can be used conveniently for any number of political forces. We've talked about sort of you can have Holocaust denial on the right and Holocaust denial on the left, which has nothing to do with memory of the Holocaust and in some sense everything to do with anti-Semitism, right? It's using Holocaust denial as a tool in the arsenal of anti-Semitism. One of the things that I find concerning about our current moment, and I mentioned this in the class on the modern period, is that I think we had this, again, naive sense about the information age, and that we're living in the information age, and that with the internet, we'll have access to facts and knowledge that will be at everybody's fingertips. And again, it was sort of, I think, a naive belief in the Enlightenment and the idea that with this access to information, as long as people were educated and they had access to rational thought, that they would dispel of these sort of ancient superstitions. And what we've seen is instead that with the internet, it's sort of the perfect place for anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and Holocaust denial of all kinds to run rampant, right? So Jonathan talked about this with the medieval blood libel, which, in Magda Tater's book, which looks at sort of how printing played an important role, the printing press in the Middle Ages, in spreading these ideas. The internet does it on steroids, right? You can take an idea and find like-minded fellow travelers and just form a group around it so quickly, right? So one of the, and this is already a question that's coming in the chat, but I'll pose it to both of you, which is based on your sort of knowledge of the Jewish past and what has been effective, for Jews in terms of responding to anti-Semitism in the past. What would you suggest would be an effective way to respond to it in the current moment? Is it possible to, and I have thoughts about the modern period, but I want to start with both of you. What do you think would be an effective way to respond to anti-Semitism? Deena, you ready to start? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that question in particular.
Academics
However,
always answer a question with a question. That's good.
It does, right? It does make me wonder if it's particularly an American naivete, and I do wonder if, if in Europe there is not as much a naivete about the rising up of anti-Semitism, because when we think of America, Jews could say that anti-Semitism, kind of saying the opposite of what I said originally, Jews could say that anti-Semitism is un-American. I mean, we could say that America was founded on these modern principles of religious freedom and diversity, church versus state separation. So, it's very, I'm not sure how to respond, but I think that I'm affirming that I think it was particularly naive of us to think that that this could end in progression. And also, I mean, a number of scholars have suggested that we don't evolve toward more progression, that's a kind of also a naive fantasy, that we're always getting better and better morally, and that could be debated here or there. But I wonder if it's particularly American to have been this naive, is something that I'm thinking about when you pose your question.
Jonathan, what do you think?
Well, I think it's unfair of you to ask the question. But since you asked the question, I don't know. I don't really know what to do. I mean, I want to believe in the power of education to enlighten people and make them better people. And but I'm not sure that is true. I'm not sure that we can be confident about the power of education, largely because, at least in the United States, the education system, at least for the instruction of history, seems to have collapsed, on the elementary, middle school, and high school level. so that the students who come to us are function, and and this is true not just of Trinity, but I think it's true of other semi-elite and elite schools, that students come functionally illiterate in history. That is, they don't have the background in periodization, chronology, events, great books, to be able to absorb and think through these problems. So I think on one level, it has to be a kind of national effort to revive a more robust kind of historical education. And I certainly would never propose any kind of censorship, but I do think that we have to sort of think about what kind of future digital world we want to live in. That is, do we want to allow a kind of world that produces these sort of marginalized communities, to keep festering and feeding on themselves in some kind of way? I would say that as if we can create a robust enough history education, I think that would quash or constrain the kinds of marginal discourse that we get now in the land of the internet. Whether we can come up with that kind of robust history education, I don't know. You're from Texas. You know that nobody can decide on how to teach the Civil War. If we can't even decide on how to teach the Civil War, how are we going to decide how to teach about anti-Semitism? So I think that that's a larger problem. In terms of particular political actions that individual Jews or Jewish communities can take, that's above my pay grade. I'm not sure. The ADL, I think, has a seminar this week on that.
Right, Never Is Now is taking place. So Deena, I'll turn it back to you in a second, but I just want to say a couple of things that I've been thinking about as you've both been speaking. And one is, I know that Stu Abrams is in the meeting, and he's participated in the class and in our virtual Holocaust educators workshop sessions, and he teaches at Avon High School, and he always.
The historical education at Avon High School is excellent from what I understand.
Yes, that's for Stu. I just want to make sure that we say that. And that there is such a great deal of variability in terms of what students learn. But by and large, right, like these surveys that we see, like the Claims Conference survey on lack of knowledge about the Holocaust, is more generalizable to just a lack of historical knowledge in general that you can find with a lot of students today. What I'll say that's interesting to think about, sort of, Jewish politics in the modern period, and this is to ask, and this was a question that came in from Carol about like, how should we respond? What I'd say that's interesting about Jewish politics in the modern period is that if you look at the Holocaust, right, so the sort of sort of paradigmatic example of political anti-Semitism and a racial ideology run wild in the modern period that targets and destroys a group of people. What's interesting to look at in terms of how Jews respond to it is that we have two very different political models for how Jews responded to the Holocaust. That is, in Israel, it confirmed Zionism, right? It was sort of the idea that, we were telling you all along that if you didn't realize that emancipation and the Enlightenment were a failure, and you didn't sort of concentrate the Jews in their own country, something like this was bound to happen, right? And for American Jews, there was sort of an opposite response, which was that, thank God we live in America. Thank God we live in a country that can, celebrate the ideals of democracy and rise up to fight fascism and totalitarianism. And we have to celebrate the role that we played in, defeating Nazism, and we have to protect that democracy, and that it is possible. And so I think, if we decide that we're invested in living here, then we have to play a role in making that, we have to play a role in strengthening that democracy as much as possible, right? And you reference a group like the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, which is sort of an organization that is committed to confronting and fighting anti-Semitism and racism and all forms of discrimination, with the ideal that we have to protect, the rights of all minorities in a democracy. And if we do that, we'll be protected in some sense as Jews while building alliances. Like, I think if we're here, that's where we should be supporting to make sure that we're realizing that vision. I think historically, the other thing that we can see is this does go in waves, right? There are periods of time with great political and economic unrest. We're living through a huge economic transformation with sort of the technological revolutions. You can think back to historical revolutions, economic revolutions of the past, huge amounts of disruption. People are very unsettled politically and economically, massive wealth disparities. We don't have regulation of these gigantic tech companies where you have gajillionaires profiting off of it, and people are feeling this huge disparity, and they're searching around for some solution. And it's not surprising that they end up with conspiracy theories that are trying to scapegoat Jews, because we know this happens throughout history. So I think, to answer Carol's question, what I would say is that if we're here and we're invested in American democracy, we have to support that. We have to protect the rights of minorities. We have to form alliances with other groups that are like-minded. We have to weather the storm, for the time being. And know that as long as we also rectify some of those huge political and economic problems that we have in the country, I think it is going to help with some of the other forms of anti-Semitism that we're seeing now as well. Deena, I know you wanted to jump in too, and then
I should let people ask questions. I could always talk later.
Yeah, because we're starting to get a number of questions. So I'm gonna, if you guys are okay with it, I'm gonna turn to some of the questions that are starting to come in. So I'm just scrolling down to the questions, and Regina, if you see ones that you want to ask also. Jonathan, this one comes from my mother, who is actually now in Austin. And she asks, is the study of European history compulsory in the United States? If not, can it be made compulsory, at least in terms of fact? And I want to ask, and I think this, since you brought up the point, Jonathan, so we have state mandates, for example, for various topics, right? Holocaust and genocide education is one that's very relevant. We have mandates to teach about African-American history, we have mandates to teach about Latinx. We have various different mandates. And I want to ask you sort of, serious question about, do you think that these type of sort of putting that responsibility on the educational system to basically teach students history, is that going to prepare them to be citizens that, are do you believe in that sort of responsibility that's cast upon educators to basically play that role in our democracy?
I guess the short answer would be yes, because if we don't do it, or people like Stu, who has been doing it, for his career, who else is going to do it, right? I mean, we're certainly not as aggressive, let's say, as the French are in a kind of centralized vision of, the French mission, or the nature of French society and French civilization. And it'll be interesting, actually, to see which society survives these challenges. I mean, we can see how the French have recently mobilized when that history teacher was murdered, assassinated so brutally. That really galvanized the French to demonstrate and to act in a much more cohesive way against Islamic terrorism. I don't think we have the same sensibility that the state, through the organs of our educational, our schools, and are speak in that same voice. It's a very different model of what education is, and it's a very, very different model of how one becomes American, right? I think in some ways it's even a more fundamental problem that, and again, this is all my election anxiety that's coming out. That is, I think we've kind of forgotten really what it means to be American. and that we've left this vacuum for all of this violence and chaos and uncertainty to kind of flow in. Now, for all the problems that the French have, and particularly for all, even with all of their ambivalence about the Jews and the role of the Jews in French society, they understand what it means to be French. They understand what it means to educate somebody as a French citizen and the values that they're supposed to convey. I'm not sure we have that same self-confidence. I'm not sure we have that same unity of voice and vision. And I think that we are going to need something like that in order to survive the challenges ahead. So I don't know, that probably doesn't answer your question.
No, I think it is interesting also that, and we can see it in the aftermath of the election. I mean, one of the things is we are a patchwork of at least 50 different systems. And then you get into a state like Connecticut where we have a mandate, but then with local control, each different school district does it differently, right? So it's, the French model is such an interesting comparison because it's completely different. So it's a constant sort of negotiation between the states and different experiences depending on when you grow up and what school system you're involved in, what school you go to, that is part of this process of sort of acquiring the ideals of citizenship here in the United States. So it's a constant process.
The only place that it happens is actually probably for new immigrants who have to take a set course on citizenship and American history. But for native-born Americans, it's, as you say, it's kind of this patchwork.
Yeah. So Deena, I'm going to throw this next question to you, which comes from Lois, who writes, "It appears that we have established that anti-Semitism is fluid. As we have seen, when political discourse is acrimonious, anti-Semitism has and continues to be used as a tool. Is a big part of the answer, as Dr. Grant suggests, that anti-Semitism is something that afflicts all of society, and we must work collaboratively with all those isms that are persecuted."
Well, yeah, I did suggest that, and definitely affirm that. It reminds me of the quote, "First they came for the socialists," and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. I mean, we are persecution, isms can be directed at anyone. When you talk about, the question is, of course, how do we work collaboratively? And I do wonder if we've kind of let the internet run amok for all these years. And I wonder if groups could think more intentionally about how to use the internet in a manner to foster relationships. Because at least I know in terms of interreligious dialogue and interfaith relations, the beginning of a lot of that starts not with the education and the intellectual ideas, but it starts with relationships and getting to know one another and then getting to empathize with one another. And I kind of wonder if a method would be using the internet, coming together to use the internet as a vehicle to foster relationships, as opposed to what it's doing now, which is creating silos. And I think that, this is a particular moment. I'm sure everybody knows Rabbi Sachs died a few days ago, and he was very good at doing just that. I think, in a sense, he was fighting, in my opinion, he fought anti-Semitism by fostering empathy among faith traditions and among peoples, and forcing people to, or compelling people to see God in other people. And so I think we should be thinking in terms of his lead, and nowadays, perhaps how to use the internet as a vehicle to accomplish some of what he began with some of his writings.
I don't know if Jonathan, if you have anything you want to add to that, or.
Yeah, well, I was just going to add, this is in some ways more a response to what you were talking about as sort of that scapegoat model, which I actually am beginning to think is a little too reductionist. That is, it does explain some things, or at least it appears to explain some things. Certainly the argument that Germany was suffering from the defeat of World War I and the chaos of Weimar, and that the people who turned to attacks on the Jews were doing it as a way to project their resentment and their own suffering and their own disorientation. And certainly there are other intersections of violence and prejudice against the Jews. And here I won't use the term anti-Semitism specifically, right? And maybe we can talk a little bit more about that. But other intersections of prejudice and violence towards the Jews from populations that appear to be suffering or aggrieved and resentful. Certainly one could make the case that some Islamic anti-Semitism, either directed towards Israel or Jews in general, comes from a population that feels itself to have been left behind in some ways or exploited by Western governments who are supporting oppressive rulers. And I think that's a reasonable argument to make. But there are also problems with that because there are certainly expressions of violence and prejudice towards the Jews that does not seem to be engaged or reacting to specific moments of grievance or personal suffering. Certainly the anti-Semitism and the anti-Israel sentiment on the left, can't by any stretch of the imagination, come from a sense, at least in the States, come from, and here I mean more about academics rather than, let's say the extreme fringe of the Black Lives Matter movement. That sense of a grievance and resentment, is just disconnected from reality. And certainly, there are other episodes and moments of anti-Jewish sentiment, that come from populations or in communities that seem free of that notion of scapegoating. And I think this is where somebody like Confino and Friedlander and others who talk about the origins of Nazi ideology really have something to teach us about kind of the mystery or, just the almost the spiritual quality. I mean, I know it's a horrible thing to say, but almost the spiritual quality of much of contemporary anti-Jewish feeling that goes under the rubric of anti-Semitism, which seems to express often a greater just sense of unease with life. That is a kind of disorientation, a kind of alienation from modern society, almost a kind of lack of religious roots, religious community, a kind of religious ideology that gives life meaning. So where do you find meaning? Where do you try to explain the world? Well, you then turn to, Jewish conspiracies to try to explain the world. So I think that's a little different than, simply an equation of, when we see people who are aggrieved and resentful, they turn to the Jews, as scapegoats. I think it's a more complicated, more mysterious, and in a way more unsettling, kind of motivation.
And I'll just follow up with, before asking, and we have 2 more questions that have come in. Renana asks, and you alluded to this question about anti-Semitism on the left. And I think this is, it gets very complicated because we've talked about trying to find affinity groups that we can ally with. And for many of us, there is this sort of, if we're worried about anti-Semitism on the right that is manifesting itself in either neo-Nazi movements or the alt-right or, extreme nationalism or ethno-nationalism, then yes, we ask the question, okay, well, let's find alliances on the left, right, that are supporting the ideals of democracy. And then we have, the challenge, as Renata poses, about, well, what happens when you turn left and you see anti-Semitism there as well? And I think, there is this, some of it is obviously connected with Israel and movements to boycott Israel. And some of it is also connected with something that, I've been struggling with how to engage with this question myself, which is sort of and we had a program just about a month ago about whiteness, right? And sort of the experiences of Jews of color, the experiences of Jews who are Black Jews who, are sort of saying, what about us, right? What's our place in the Jewish community? We shouldn't just think of Jews as Ashkenazi. And certainly, right, in Israel, we can think about like the whole notion of whiteness or Jews of color is a whole different sort of conversation. But I do think that at the same time, like there is a tendency to sort of reduce into categories of, us and them, oppressed people of color. If Jews must be white, so they must be those who are either privileged or oppressing. And it does put sort of Jews in a very difficult position to say, no, don't forget that we have been victims of persecution, discrimination. We continue to be victims of persecution, discrimination, and that Jews are not white, or sort of broadening and complicating the category. But in some sense, it is part of the same sort of challenge of saying, Jews and Jewish identity cuts across all these easy categories of definition, right? Like Jews are here to complicate things, and sometimes that's not sort of very comfortable or pleasant. So, I do appreciate that question and sort of the difficulties of, what's in store there with trying to find those right political alliances to confront it. I do want to get to a couple of other questions that have come in, if you don't mind. So Joseph asks, I wonder if either of you want to respond to this one. Joseph asks, I wonder if the moves in U.S. courts to discriminate against those of a particular sexual orientation in the name of religious freedom might open the door to discrimination against other groups. Is this a slippery slope? And, I think sort of this goes back to, democratic ideals of how we want to construct our state, and the ideal of separation of church and state, and certainly no establishment of one religion that takes priority over another religion. I mean, it gets very, very complicated. I think in that question, we already have the answer that yes, there is a slippery slope there where you start to privilege certain ideals over others, and you start to restrict the rights of discriminated groups by saying, well, it infringes upon others' religious practices. I don't know, maybe Deena, if you know, Jonathan, if you have thoughts, or okay, you feel comfortable with that response. But I agree with sort of
Avi, it's Gary Starr. I think what you're missing, though, in the constitutional question is that race and religion are constitutionally protected. Sex is not, and LGBTQ. Thank you. Rights arise out of sex, and that's legislative. And there's a distinction that the courts, at least the Supreme Court, is looking like it's making a distinction between constitutionally based rights and statutory rights. And that's where that's the whole case today that's being argued on by Philadelphia and the city of Philadelphia, because Philadelphia wanted to impose on the Catholic charity that they handle requests for foster care by gay families. And the Catholic Church was saying no. And so the question was, do they have a constitutional exemption from that? But that may not be the slippery slope. Has some hard stops constitutionally.
Okay, thank you, Gary. I appreciate that insight. Yes, it's and I think it shows the complexities, right? But at the same time, I think this is a very, very thorny issue, and in terms of sort of opening the door for the possibility of so yes, if it's the state imposing upon a religious charity that that it has to recognize certain things that are against its beliefs, but we could also see this potentially going the other way in future decisions, I guess. But I'm not an expert on this, so I'll certainly defer to you. But I will, Gary, because you asked the next question, so I'm going to turn to your next question, which is here, which I think is a really interesting one about also thinking about how we confront these forms of discrimination. And you say, what we are seeing is a lack of empathy or consideration of the other, right? And these forms of all the isms that we've talked about. The myth of the melting pot has been replaced overtly by tribalism. And as Deena was alluding to before, when we look at sort of the internet, instead of fostering connections that might exist, we see more of this creation of silos, more of this tribalism, Facebook groups where you just find like-minded fellow travelers and you don't engage with others. So Gary, your suggestion, rather than trying to force legislatures to adopt Holocaust studies, which only focuses on Jews in special consideration, without, and we can list any number of genocides, right? In this category, you identify Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge, but Rwanda, Armenia, we could go on. Would we be better off focusing instead on teaching appreciation of the other and empathy and common humanity, right? So instead of saying, let's focus on cases of historical suffering, genocide, destruction, let's focus our education on sort of empathy, on appreciation of the other, on appreciation of difference. Yeah, Deena, please go ahead.
My answer would actually be no and yes. In terms, and I'm thinking about this in terms of what happens, my experiences in the classroom. So the no part would be, I was teaching a course, Introduction to Judaism, and I only had 1 3-hour period to teach about the Holocaust. I went through my 2 hours and opened it up for questions, expecting people to ask questions about, to discuss about the Holocaust. And instead, my students focused on, well, what about Black slavery? And of course, what about Black slavery? That is, but what I found interesting was this kind of, there was a thought, how could you talk about the Holocaust without talking about another group that has been oppressed? And that becomes dangerous once you start having kind of competing, well, we're only talking about this and we're not talking enough about this. So I think it's dangerous to generally say we need to teach about empathy and not actually teaching specifically the experience of the Jim Crow laws and Black slavery, as well as specifically about the Holocaust and Jewish anti-Semitism, because we have to be careful of people feeling as if, well, if you're talking about this, then you're not talking about me. So that would be my no part of the answer. Oh, Gary?
Yeah, I was just going to comment that, in fact, I think you're making my point, is that if we talk about the Holocaust only, we create us as a special group, and then people point to us as a special category, and then we lose all those other examples where everyone else feels you can only have so many victims before everybody's a victim. So that's why trying to create some kind of commonality of humanity.
Yeah,
while recognizing that, yes, we've had lots of suffering and still have lots of suffering.
Indeed. And actually, as I was speaking, I was thinking, I'm also really kind of saying your point. Nonetheless, I think we have to be careful, because empathy can become very diluted. And if you don't have education alongside that kind of kumbaya experience, where all humanity, it can be problematic. But yes, I definitely affirm your point. And so the second part of my thought about your comment has to do with the same class where I was teaching about Israel and Zionism. And yet in the classroom, I had some Jewish students and I had some Muslim students whose family was from Palestine. And I thought to myself, how am I going to do this? This is an impossible thing to do and to foster good feelings. And so instead, I had people do reading. But in the classroom, I thought to myself, okay, we're going to focus on empathy, because we're all living on our silos. And the one thing that we're missing is the experience of the other. And so what I did was I compared some Facebook pages of you know, what I was seeing on my Facebook page versus what a friend of mine was seeing. Actually, one of my students whose family was from the territories, what she was seeing on her Facebook pages, and we were both seeing images of, you know, horrible images, but we weren't seeing each other's images. And so, you know, by just looking at the other person's kind of what they were seeing versus what we were seeing, I felt that it just kind of, it helped us a little bit understand more of the common humanity. And then as well, I took some of the newspapers that I was reading versus the newspapers that the student of mine was reading. And we were living in completely different worlds. And so the class together, at minimum, we were able to for a moment, you know, step into the other person's shoes, because I think in a case that is so painful and so difficult, it's really not necessarily about facts and even about the narrative that you're living within. It gets back, it gets into your point of empathy for common humanity. So, indeed.
Yeah, and I thank you for the question, Gary, and I think your response, Deena, is fascinating, because I think what I think it points to also is that you know, these categories are not mutually exclusive, right? That we don't have to give up on Jonathan's vision of sort of good historical education, of making sure that students learn about different historical events, but it doesn't have to end up in sort of a situation of competitive suffering, right? And the politics of education, right? Why are you teaching about this and not about that? Because, you know, as Deena suggested, we have to keep in mind, what is our ultimate educational goal, right? Why are we teaching students about this? Are we teaching students about this so they can memorize the historical facts? Probably not, right? Because that's not going to have long-term staying power. But as Deena was suggesting, right, one goal of that is that we could teach about these historical events to bolster empathy, right? To make sure that they understand what it's like to experience history from the perspective of the other. I have a colleague at the University of Connecticut, Alan Marcus, who does this in his teaching of the Holocaust through film. And he talks about how film can be such an excellent technique to develop empathy, right? So in that, you're learning history, but you're also learning sort of important moral education about you know, what Gary's asking us to do. So I don't think that they have to be mutually exclusive. Also realizing that, you know, there's a limit. We have teachers here who are, you know, in this workshop today. There's a limit to how much you can teach in a day, in a week, in a month, in a year, you know, however much time you have your students for. And that's where I think the goal is not to sort of memorize all the historical facts, but it is to make sure that some of those lessons are absorbed, like Deena was talking about empathy and understanding. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So I will, and I just want to follow up because Joseph writes in here. I want to, Joseph, do you want to read your, as this is one of our educator workshops, I don't know if Joseph is here, if you can read your comment, Joseph LeWerk.
Sure. So yeah, I'm a high school teacher, social studies. So I was pleased that, you know, Connecticut's adoption of the mandate to teach about the Holocaust and genocide across the grade levels. But I am concerned about whether there will be fidelity to the mandate, since students in schools will continue to be pressed to improve literacy and numeracy skills. With the improvement of those skills being the measure of academic success, and I put that in quotes, and the school day not getting any longer, I'm afraid that these mandates will receive only lip service. Many schools and teachers may merely turn the mandate into a literacy-oriented exercise, which may live up to the letter of the mandate law, but not the spirit. So.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Joseph. And I would say that this is one of the great concerns with these types of mandates, especially where we have a law that's passed without, you know, a great deal of support behind it on the state level in terms of providing the resources that are needed for how to do this. And so it's up to dedicated teachers who want to seek out the opportunities for professional advancement and engagement, like in a workshop like this, or like doing something with Echoes and Reflections or the Holocaust Museum or Facing History in Ourselves. I mean, there's all sorts of things, but it usually is up to the teachers to sort of seek out those opportunities. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do, both through the Greenberg Center's programs and the UConn programs and Voices of Hope and the Hero Center, is to precisely try to provide those resources so that it doesn't end up being this type of a mandate where, because I think you're 100% right, Joseph, without the support to sort of, and the guidance for teachers of, to focus on what are the ultimate goals of this, what is the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the law. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So it's not just about, the skills of like multiple choice tests, but what we've just been talking about, but it has to be clearly articulated. And I think we're working on that, but it hasn't been done yet. There's more to be done in that area. Jonathan.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think that in some ways, I was being kind of apocalyptic in my comment about the collapse of history education. And I certainly didn't mean to cast aspersions on, the work that our colleagues in the high school history field, social studies do. I think what I was trying to suggest, again, from my own frustration with my students, is that it's more of a kind of societal collapse. That is, our values and priorities are such that people who try to teach history, either on the middle school, high school, or college level, we're really swimming against a cultural tide that seems very, very difficult to overcome and to stay afloat in. Even if you look at the rhetoric of the politicians in our continuing election, our ongoing election, nobody spoke about history. Nobody spoke about sort of the American story, the American narrative, what it means to be an American. I mean, there was lip service and sound bites and things, but there's no sustained interaction with the meaning of the American past that Lincoln did, even Kennedy, Roosevelt. So that I think this struggle with the past is something as a country that we've got to face and we've got to come to terms with. Otherwise, we're going to be continuing to produce, both at the college level and the high school level, kids who have these kind of glimpses of empathy, these glimpses of identity, but really nothing substantive to hold on to sustain them. So when there are challenges from the far right or from the far left, they're very susceptible to it. There's a vacuum at the center where this kind of marginal, distorted conspiratorial knowledge can rush in. And that to me is the real threat here. It's a threat which allows for the propagation not just of violence and prejudice towards the Jews, but of racism, of Islamophobia, so-called, any other kinds of marginalization or demonization of minority groups. How we're going to fix that, I don't know.
So I want to give each of you a chance before we conclude to sort of offer some thoughts to pull this all together, in the sense that we are here at the end of a class that does look at the past, present, and future of anti-Semitism. And we've spent time, which I think is appropriate for our evening, in terms of a commemoration of Kristallnacht, thinking about the mandate and about Holocaust education in the state of Connecticut. But I also want us to think about this current moment that we're in, where it does, of course, as it should, dominate our thoughts. We've just gone through an election where we know that 70 million or so Americans who participate in the election cast votes either knowing, I'm not saying what, about anyone's choice, but with the knowledge of a candidate who, has either not condemned anti-Semitism, given support for groups, called for them to either stand at the ready, right? We can think about everything. And so I think for a lot of people who are here this evening, sort of thinking about anti-Semitism in America today, there is this question about sort of, what does this mean? right? That 70 million Americans might know this and still choose to support such a candidate. And so I want to ask you, by way of sort of concluding, we've talked about what are we supposed to do, but what gives you reason for optimism about the future, about sort of how we might get through this period and confront anti-Semitism, both in America, around the world, that we know historically things do tend to go in these cycles. So what gives you reason to hope that this might get better? Deena, do you feel ready to start with this one? Yeah.
Sure. To go back to my own personal area of expertise, which is Bible, and going back to my talk, where I focused a lot on supersessionism and Christian antagonism toward the Jews. What I think about is Vatican II, where there was a big kind of watershed change, a moment of a few years, where this hundreds and hundreds of years of anti-Judaism, culminated in a moment of what I might call enough is enough. And if I could take a moment to read from the Biblical Pontifical Commission on the Jewish people and their sacred scriptures, their conclusion. And you might think, just if you think back on just some of the awful things I had on that PowerPoint some weeks back that were said about the Jews here in the 1970s, I'll read that and remember particularly, I don't know if you might recall, Paul referred to the Jews as the vessels of God's wrath. And here we have the church leaders saying, the example of Paul in Romans 9-11 shows that, on the contrary, an attitude of respect, esteem, and love for the Jewish people is the only truly Christian attitude in a situation which is mysteriously part of the beneficent and positive plan of God. Dialogue is possible, since Jews and Christians share a rich common patrimony that unites them. And I would add, dialogue is possible because human beings share a common humanity, and we can generalize that, and we can use that moment in Christianity as a model for the rest of us in this modern period.
Thank you, Deena. Jonathan, go ahead.
Well, I don't have anything quite as apt or concise and poignant as that to offer. I would say that what gives me hope is the capacity for increasing precision and a kind of nuanced understanding of the past, so that the historical endeavor itself, I think, is a pathway, if not to immediate social peace and social justice, tolerance and equality, but that the generational struggle to understand the past will eventually, I hope, lead to enlightenment. The Enlightenment took a long time, right? It took Spinoza, it took many generations to produce Spinoza. It took many generations to produce a vision of the past that accepted the multiplicity of religious beliefs. It took many generations to accept the conflicts between Jews and Christians, between Christians and Muslims. And I think we are still in that process, right? We think of ourselves as modern. We think these things should have been resolved. I think that may be a particularly American approach. It may be a particularly post-Enlightenment approach. But I think that this process of understanding human beings and human societies is something that is going to go on for a very long time. But that being said, we have the capacity to do it because we have seen ourselves do it. We have learned. We just may not have learned enough quickly enough, but we still have the capacity to learn from the past and to adjust our contemporary behavior. It may not be perfect, it may not be immediate, and it may be, our grandchildren, our children's children. It may have a kind of biblical time frame rather than a kind of internet time frame. But that's still my hope, I guess.
So the good news is that in the span of 3,000 or 4,000 years, we should be able to get this figured out.
Which is in the scope of humanity is a blink of the eyes. So it wouldn't be so terrible.
So I will say that, I think we have seen sort of the history sort of gives us some comfort in terms of evolving over time and knowing that there are cycles. And as you pointed to, Jonathan, in your session, right, that while we tend to focus on sort of the periods of rupture, there are very long periods of sort of tranquility in between the periods of rupture, right? And that we know that those will come just as well as the sort of the periods of rupture might be upon us and might come and go at different points in time. I do feel optimism about sort of levels of engagement, about young people who are growing up in a time like this and do feel that they have a responsibility and obligation to confront all these many threats that they're seeing before them, both in the term of, in sense of political injustice that we've talked about, racial injustice that we've talked about, economic injustice, right? That there is sort of a climate crisis. There is an awareness on the part of, and I don't envy millennials and Gen Z with what we've left them in a sense, but there is a great deal, and I think the teachers who are here would support this. There is a great deal of engagement and enthusiasm to confront these challenges, right? And this is kind of how history works, right? That we sort of leave these challenges and the next generation picks up the ball and carries it forward. I do have optimism in the, and faith in the power of education. Maybe it's naive, but I think this is why we do what we do. And I think, a lot of folks appreciate sort of the role, especially now when we think about living through a pandemic and the role that educators are playing, sort of the dedication to make sure that they, even endangering their lives, are going to make sure that the children are educated. That does give me a lot of hope for the future. Yeah, Jonathan, please.
Just a quick thought on the pandemic, which I think is interesting, that, it could have gone very badly for the Jews, right? That the pandemic could have been a launching pad for, these horrible conspiracy theories. And I'm sure they exist in some corners of the internet, but I think on the whole, if we get to the Pfizer vaccine in 6 or 8 months, whatever, I think we've done pretty well, which suggests that, there is some realism, there is some kind of evolution of these fantasy worlds about the Jews and conspiracy and power, whereas we haven't been, tarred with this brush about the pandemic. So I take that as a hopeful sign.
I think, if I would say that, certain internet searches would point you in certain directions that maybe you don't want to go.
But, right, but in the general discourse, right, in the general public discourse, that does not seem to be tolerated. Some things are, but that is not tolerated.
Right. And I do feel that, one thing that's become clear is that it does matter sort of the leadership that's coming from above. It does matter, like if anti-Semitism is there and it's beneath the surface, that, there are certain things that can be done to keep it beneath the surface. And we can see what happens when it feels sort of a license to emerge. And I think that also has to do with the internet as well. So, and maybe regulation that will take place to restrict this kind of speech. Not every speech should be free speech. So I apologize. I know there are some people who have questions that we didn't get to. I think we'd be happy to respond to these questions on our own time, and we'll be glad to take these questions. I see Adam's question and Carol's question, but I think in the interest of time, we will wrap up for this evening. So I want to thank everyone for joining us for this program. I want to thank our panelists, Deena Grant and Jonathan Elukin. I want to thank the Greenberg Center for co-sponsoring this class and this series, and thank Regina Miller and Joel Messing, who are the driving force behind the graduate study in Jewish education series that this was part of. I want to thank all of you for being here this evening. The fourth session of the Virtual Holocaust Educators Workshop, I see that she is here in the meeting with us, Amy Weiss, who is the incoming director of the Center for Judaic Studies, will be delivering the fourth session of the Virtual Holocaust Educators Workshop next Thursday, November 19th, on American Jewish responses to the Holocaust. So for those who can join us again, or for any of the upcoming programs that we have coming in the next 2 weeks, we look forward to seeing you soon. Everybody be well, stay healthy, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you in person once that vaccine is here. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Avi.